Madeline Carter was 41 years old when she felt that everything she had spent her entire life building was beginning to shatter right before her eyes. Barely 3 weeks had passed since the somber funeral of her beloved parents, and she still found it incredibly difficult to accept that she would never again hear their warm voices on the telephone, receive their gentle advice, or attend the traditional family gatherings every Sunday afternoon. The heavy sadness remained present in every single moment of her day, from the second she woke up to the quiet times she sat down to eat, and even when she desperately tried to find sleep during the long, dark nights. However, the profound pain of her immense loss soon began to mix with something much more unexpected and bitter, something she never imagined she would experience with the one person she had shared her entire childhood with. Her older sister, Lucy Carter, had changed drastically. Or perhaps she had always been this way, and Madeline had simply chosen to blindly ignore the harsh reality for all these years. The complicated ordeal began when Arthur, the trusted family lawyer, summoned both grieving sisters to his downtown office to formally review the complicated matters related to the family inheritance. Madeline arrived seeking comfort, accompanied by her supportive husband, Richard Newman, simply hoping to quickly resolve the necessary legal paperwork to close such a painful and emotionally exhausting chapter of their lives. Lucy appeared at the office entirely alone, dressed with sharp elegance, walking with an intimidating confidence, and displaying a strange tranquility that Madeline found deeply unsettling, considering how recent the tragic family loss had been. During the tense meeting, the lawyer softly explained that there were multiple properties, lucrative investments, various bank accounts, and several valuable assets that needed to be divided according to the last wishes left behind by their parents. Madeline genuinely expected a simple, straightforward process because, after all, she had never experienced any major relationship-ending problems with Lucy throughout their long lives. They had naturally argued over small things like any normal pair of sisters, but Madeline never once thought that cold, hard money could permanently sever the deep blood bond between them. However, the first terrible surprise arrived just a few short minutes after the formal reading of the documents initiated inside the quiet, wood-paneled room. Lucy confidently presented several thick legal documents that Madeline had never seen in her entire life, papers that carried heavy implications. According to those mysterious papers, their parents had supposedly granted Lucy special executive powers to solely administer a massive portion of the family wealth during their final declining years. Madeline stared at the signed pages over and over again, her mind spinning, completely unable to comprehend the unbelievable situation that was unfolding right in front of her. She looked at her sister and directly asked when exactly these highly suspicious documents had been authorized and signed. Lucy responded with icy naturalness that their parents had placed their ultimate trust in her simply because she was the eldest, and because she possessed significantly more experience handling complex financial matters. The hollow explanation did not convince Madeline in the slightest, because their parents had always treated both of their daughters with absolute equality and endless love. They had never once displayed any form of favoritism. Yet the ink on the documents appeared to be entirely authentic and legally binding. When the agonizing meeting finally concluded, Richard wrapped his arm around his wife and gently tried to reassure her broken spirit. He promised her that everything would surely be clarified with a little more time and patience. Madeline desperately wanted to believe her husband's comforting words, but the following days only served to multiply her dark, lingering doubts. Every single time she called the lawyer's office to request basic information, she was shocked to discover that Lucy had already made massive executive decisions without ever consulting her. Various long-term investments were being rapidly liquidated, several prime real estate properties were already listed in the active process of being sold, and even certain secure bank accounts had been drastically reorganized under brand-new administrative conditions. Madeline immediately began to feel entirely excluded from critical family decisions that rightfully belonged to her just as much as they belonged to her sister. One cloudy afternoon, she decided to drive directly to her sister's upscale suburban house, hoping to sit down and speak with calm, rational maturity. When Lucy finally pulled open the heavy front door, she greeted Madeline with a chilling, calculated smile that Madeline had never witnessed before in her life. The conversation began cordially enough, but it rapidly deteriorated into a fierce, heartbreaking argument right there in the pristine, brightly lit foyer. Madeline tearfully asked why her sister was acting entirely alone, stripping away their shared legacy without sharing a single piece of information. Lucy callously replied that someone had to take charge of the family empire because Madeline seemed far too busy crying and mourning to handle the real world. Those cruel, dismissive words struck Madeline's heart harder than she ever could have anticipated, leaving her completely speechless. She could not believe that her own flesh and blood would speak with such ruthless disrespect so soon after the tragic passing of their loving parents. Madeline tried her absolute best to maintain her composure, but the heated conversation only grew worse when Lucy boldly claimed that many of the family properties represented a financial burden and that selling them off quickly was the smartest possible decision. Madeline walked out of that house with a crushing sensation of deep anguish and heavy betrayal that she could not shake off for many long, sleepless days. As the weeks dragged on, new and devastating financial updates continuously arrived. One prime commercial property was aggressively sold, and then shortly after, another one was liquidated. Then, several substantial stock investments completely vanished from the financial records that Madeline had previously known about. Every single time she demanded clear explanations, she received only ambiguous, evasive responses from Lucy's hired legal team. Richard began to grow genuinely concerned about their own future. Although he tried to remain an anchor of positivity, he could clearly see that something incredibly deceptive was unfolding. One quiet night, while they were reviewing a mountain of legal documents on their kitchen table, they found glaring inconsistencies that instantly caught their attention. Certain dates simply did not align, and several massive financial transfers seemed suspiciously rushed, executed at bizarre hours. Richard firmly suggested hiring an independent, private accountant to thoroughly investigate the entire administrative process from the outside. Madeline agreed without hesitation, knowing deep down that she desperately needed to uncover the hidden truth. During the following days, an experienced accountant named Mr. Jenkins meticulously analyzed every available piece of documentation he could legally access. What he ultimately discovered was not quite enough to officially charge Lucy with a criminal offense, but it revealed a highly disturbing, undeniable pattern. The vast majority of the family's wealth was changing hands with an unnatural, frantic speed, as if someone was in a desperate rush to convert every single hard asset into untraceable, liquid cash. When Madeline heard that terrifying conclusion from the accountant, she felt a sickening knot twist deep within her stomach. She decided she had to confront her older sister one last time, but she refused to step foot in Lucy's house again. Instead, she demanded they meet at a crowded downtown restaurant to ensure the conversation took place in a public, neutral environment. Lucy surprisingly accepted the tense invitation. During the first few minutes, they exchanged painfully forced, normal pleasantries, but the heavy tension sitting between them was impossible to ignore. Finally, Madeline set her coffee cup down and asked directly, looking straight into Lucy's eyes, if she was intentionally trying to steal the entire family legacy. Lucy slowly placed her silver cutlery on the table and stared back with an unwavering, hardened expression. For several agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence between the two siblings. Then, Lucy coldly stated that she had sacrificed more for the family over the years and, therefore, inherently deserved to claim a significantly larger portion of their parents' massive wealth. Madeline was left entirely stunned. She had never once heard her sister express such deep, toxic resentment before. Lucy continued to speak, dragging up trivial situations that had occurred decades ago, old childhood comparisons, minor family decisions, and supposed injustices that Madeline could not even recall. That pivotal conversation marked the absolute point of no return. For the very first time, Madeline fully understood that the root problem was never just about the money. There were deep, poisonous emotions that had been secretly festering inside Lucy for years. When the bitter meeting ended, Lucy stood up and walked out of the restaurant without looking back or saying goodbye. From that dreadful moment forward, she completely stopped answering Madeline's frantic phone calls and pleading text messages. The legal paperwork continued to advance rapidly, without Madeline having any power to stop the bleeding. 1 month passed, and then another excruciating month followed. Every new piece of news delivered by the lawyer was significantly worse than the last. Finally, the hardest blow of all was delivered on a rainy Tuesday morning. The lawyer formally announced that the vast majority of the valuable assets had already been liquidated, and the massive sum of cash had been legally transferred into private accounts. Madeline felt the solid ground completely vanish beneath her trembling feet. The most shocking revelation was discovering that Lucy had already prepared everything required to permanently flee the United States of America. She had quietly sold her own suburban home, closed all her local bank accounts, and carefully organized her permanent relocation to an undisclosed European country. When Madeline desperately tried to track her down, it was already far too late. Lucy was gone, without any farewells, without any apologies, and seemingly without any intention of ever returning to her homeland. The only tangible asset that remained completely untouched was a property that absolutely nobody in the market had wanted to purchase. It was a colossal, decaying antique mansion located deep in the rural outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, situated miles away from the bustling city limits. For many long years, the grand estate had remained practically abandoned, slowly surrendering to the creeping Spanish moss and the humid southern weather. It required incredibly expensive structural repairs and held a terrifyingly dark reputation among the superstitious locals of the region. Absolutely no one wanted to step foot near the looming, shadowed property. While all the other family assets disappeared one after another, that ancient southern construction remained perfectly intact, simply because there were zero interested buyers willing to take on the burden. Weeks later, when the final inheritance documents were officially delivered into Madeline's trembling hands, she discovered that this cursed mansion was practically the only thing left to her name. She sat in her living room, staring blankly at the thick stack of papers for many long, quiet minutes. That decaying Savannah house represented the very last visible remnant of her family's once proud legacy. Richard sat down gently beside her on the sofa and wrapped his warm hands around hers. Neither of them spoke a single word for a long time, listening only to the steady ticking of the hallway clock. They both knew their current financial situation was becoming incredibly complicated, as the costly legal battles had drained their once comfortable savings. They also deeply understood that their shared future had suddenly become frighteningly uncertain. However, they could not possibly imagine that this forgotten property, despised by everyone and considered an absolute financial nightmare, was about to change the trajectory of their lives in a way neither of them could have ever predicted. After receiving those final documents, Madeline spent days desperately trying to wrap her mind around how she had ended up in such a devastating position. Every time she glanced at the thick folders resting on her dining table, she was hit with an overwhelming mixture of deep sorrow, burning anger, and sheer disbelief. She found it nearly impossible to accept that her beloved parents had worked tirelessly their entire lives to build a substantial empire, only for almost all of it to vanish into thin air in the blink of an eye. What truly broke her heart wasn't the loss of the money itself. It was the agonizing realization that the mastermind behind this profound betrayal was her own sister. Richard tried his absolute best to remain the strong, unshakable pillar for both of them during this dark time. Every morning he went to his demanding job, and every evening he returned with a new optimistic idea to help them move forward. Yet, Madeline could easily read the deep, lingering lines of worry etched across his tired face. Their joint savings account was shrinking entirely too fast. The monthly bills continued to pile up relentlessly, and the suffocating pressure of the situation worsened with every passing week. Desperate to find a way out, Madeline attempted to sell the rural Savannah property. She contacted multiple real estate brokers, published numerous online advertisements, and relentlessly sought out wealthy private investors. But the results were entirely discouraging. Some potential buyers abruptly canceled their scheduled visits the moment they heard the dark local rumors surrounding the property. Others drove all the way to the rusted iron entrance gates, took one look at the imposing, shadowy structure, and immediately turned their cars around without even stepping out. One particular real estate agent was brutally honest with her during a phone call. He firmly stated that the estate possessed such a toxic, terrifying reputation that it would likely take many years to find a single buyer willing to shoulder the massive risk. That blunt response left Madeline feeling profoundly trapped and deeply terrified for their future. Every single week that passed meant more draining expenses and fewer available resources to keep them afloat in their expensive city apartment. One quiet night, while they were eating a simple dinner in heavy silence, Richard made a bold decision that would alter the course of their destiny. He looked across the table and proposed that they pack up their lives and move directly into the abandoned mansion. Madeline snapped her head up, staring at him with wide, shocked eyes. For a few brief seconds, she genuinely thought he was making a terrible, tasteless joke to break the tension. But Richard's expression remained completely serious and resolute. He logically explained that continuing to pay exorbitant city rent while they actually owned a massive piece of property simply made zero financial sense anymore. Perhaps the ancient house desperately needed repairs, and perhaps the local ghost stories were just wild exaggerations. But at the very least, they would have a solid roof over their heads while they figured out a permanent solution. Madeline listened to his reasoning with her heart pounding against her ribs. The radical idea filled her with genuine dread and deep uncertainty. However, the more she critically analyzed their shrinking options, the more logical the frightening proposal seemed. They simply did not have the luxury of alternative choices. Their financial resources were evaporating rapidly, and the faint hope of selling the cursed mansion seemed further away than ever before. During the following days, they decided to drive out to the property to honestly evaluate its physical condition. The drive was exceptionally long and exhausting. As they navigated further away from the modern highways and onto the narrow, dirt-covered rural roads of Georgia, Madeline felt an undeniable, creeping tension building in her chest. Finally, the enormous, Gothic construction emerged at the end of an overgrown, tree-lined path. The mansion was even more massive and intimidating than she remembered from her faint childhood memories. Despite the obvious decay, the towering structure retained a haunting, majestic presence. The tall, arched windows were completely coated in thick layers of grime. Portions of the elegant exterior paint were severely peeled, revealing gray, weathered wood underneath. The sprawling gardens had grown wild and untamed for years, yet the core structural foundation remained stubbornly upright. As she stared at the immense house, Madeline experienced a sensation that was nearly impossible to articulate. It was a strange mixture of deep anxiety and magnetic curiosity, almost as if the silent house had been patiently waiting for something. It felt as though the estate had held its breath for decades, quietly anticipating the exact right moment to finally reveal its darkest, most protected secrets. Without even realizing it, Madeline had just stepped onto the very path that would completely transform absolutely everything she thought she knew about her family's hidden legacy. The difficult decision was finalized. After several long weeks of analyzing their grim options, crunching numbers, and facing a reality that grew colder by the day, Madeline and Richard began the arduous preparations to leave the city and relocate to the ancient Savannah mansion. Neither of them felt an ounce of excitement about the massive transition. Rather, it was a harsh, necessary survival measure to stop their financial bleeding. Still, as they carefully packed their remaining belongings into cardboard boxes, they both desperately tried to convince themselves that this radical change might represent a fresh, healing start. Moving day arrived with a blanket of thick gray clouds. A heavy rented truck was loaded with their essential furniture and the numerous boxes they had chosen to keep. The long journey took several hours. As they left the modern skyline behind, the tall buildings were gradually replaced by vast stretches of open fields, narrow winding roads, and tiny rustic towns where time seemed to move at a crawl. Madeline stared out the passenger window in absolute silence, wondering what her parents would think if they could see her starting over in a decaying property that nobody else in the world wanted. When they finally arrived, the mansion loomed at the end of the long driveway, framed by enormous oak trees draped in Spanish moss. It was a multi-level antique structure featuring rusted iron balconies and towering windows hidden behind years of accumulated dirt. The front yard was a chaotic sea of overgrown weeds and intrusive vines that had aggressively claimed the lower half of the stone facade. Richard parked the heavy truck, and they both sat in the cab for several long minutes, just staring at the intimidating property before finally gathering the courage to step out. Madeline took a deep breath, walked up the cracked stone steps, and pushed against the heavy wooden front door. It emitted a loud, groaning creak as it slowly swung open, releasing a stale gust of trapped, dusty air. The interior was incredibly dark, illuminated only by the faint light struggling through the dirty glass. The antique furniture remained exactly where it had been abandoned decades ago, mostly covered by yellowing sheets that looked like quiet ghosts in the shadows. The very first days were entirely consumed by exhausting physical labor. Madeline and Richard worked from sunrise to sunset, furiously sweeping away thick dust, forcing open stubborn windows to let in the humid southern breeze, and assessing the condition of the massive rooms. The physical effort was monumental because the house possessed far more square footage than two people could ever possibly need. They discovered entire wings that had clearly not been accessed in generations, filled with frozen moments of their family's forgotten history. As they meticulously cleaned, they began uncovering strange, fascinating items hidden beneath the grime. They found antique pocket watches that had stopped ticking long ago, faded family portraits, and bundles of old documents forgotten inside heavy oak desk drawers. One particular afternoon, Madeline wiped the dust off a framed photograph and gasped. It was a picture of her grandfather standing proudly in front of this very mansion when he was a young man. The pristine condition of the house in the photograph starkly contrasted with the decaying reality they were currently living in. Meanwhile, the residents of the nearby town, Willow Creek, quickly caught wind that the notorious Carter estate was finally occupied again. A friendly but cautious neighbor named Sarah brought them a welcoming pie and couldn't resist sharing the local lore. She explicitly warned them that since she was a little girl, people had sworn they saw flickering, unnatural lights moving behind the upper windows of the empty house. Another older gentleman, a retired mechanic named Thomas, claimed that when he worked near the property 50 years ago, he regularly heard heavy, rhythmic thuds echoing from the basement. Richard, always the rational thinker, gently dismissed the spooky stories, attributing the noises to the settling of ancient wooden beams and the lights to passing car reflections. Madeline desperately wanted to agree with her husband's logic, but the oppressive atmosphere of the house made the rumors hard to ignore. As the weeks rolled by, the sheer isolation of the rural property became glaringly apparent at night. The absolute silence was deafening, occasionally broken only by the wind howling through the old trees, until the night they heard the distinct, deliberate sound of 3 heavy knocks coming from deep within the walls. The discovery of the hollow-sounding wooden panel in the dusty parlor completely derailed Madeline and Richard's daily cleaning routine. Up until that breathtaking moment, the various clues they had stumbled upon, the weirdly positioned family portrait, the strange midnight knocking, the cryptic notes in the desk, were easily dismissible as mere coincidences. But now, standing before a beautifully carved oak wall that echoed with a distinct emptiness when tapped, they possessed undeniable physical proof that the mansion was hiding something intentional. Richard immediately fetched a set of tools from the truck, carefully examining the ornate edges of the woodwork so he wouldn't damage the historic craftsmanship. Madeline knelt directly beside him on the hardwood floor, shining a bright flashlight into the intricate grooves of the wood. They spent over an hour meticulously inspecting every single inch of the massive panel. Finally, Richard's thumb brushed against a tiny, oddly shaped piece of dark metal disguised within a carved wooden rose. He pressed it gently at first, but when nothing happened, he applied significantly more pressure until a sharp, mechanical click echoed loudly from inside the wall. Slowly, the heavy wooden panel slid sideways on a hidden internal track, revealing a dark, dust-filled compartment that had clearly not seen the light of day in many decades. Inside the secret alcove sat a stack of thick, leather-bound journals, several brittle rolled maps, and a heavy tin lockbox covered in cobwebs. Richard carefully lifted the artifacts out of the darkness and placed them on a nearby table, while Madeline watched with a racing heart. She opened the first fragile journal and immediately recognized the elegant, sweeping handwriting of her late grandfather. The initial pages detailed mundane daily activities and standard agricultural business, but as she flipped further, the entries transformed into something entirely unexpected. Her grandfather wrote extensively about acquiring massive tracts of international real estate, securing millions of dollars in foreign investments, and organizing secret family meetings that Madeline had never once heard about. These astonishing records proved that her grandfather possessed a staggering level of wealth and influence that had been completely erased from the official family history Lucy had presented to the lawyers. As they spread the fragile, hand-drawn maps across the dining table, Richard noticed something peculiar about the architectural layout depicted on the yellowed parchment. The ink drawings included several corridors, basement levels, and hidden rooms that absolutely did not exist on the modern blueprints of the estate. Certain locations were marked with a very specific recurring symbol, a highly detailed 8-pointed star. One margin note, scribbled hastily in red ink, simply read that the true legacy must remain buried until the rightful heir proves their worth to the family name. While they were deeply engrossed in unraveling the historical mystery, their intense focus was suddenly shattered by the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. Madeline peered through the dusty parlor window and saw a sleek, expensive black car parked near the front steps. A sharply dressed man in his late 50s stepped out, projecting an aura of calculated confidence. He confidently introduced himself as Ethan Saunders, a prominent local real estate developer, who claimed he had always harbored a deep, personal fascination with the historic architecture of the Savannah region. Ethan flashed a polished, charming smile and smoothly offered to purchase the decaying mansion for an astronomical sum of cash, a number far beyond the actual market value of the ruined estate. Madeline found the excessive offer deeply suspicious. Why would a wealthy businessman want to overpay for a property that everyone else considered a cursed, unfixable nightmare? She firmly but politely declined his generous offer, noting how the friendly warmth in Ethan's eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare before he turned and drove away. That unsettling visit confirmed Madeline's worst fears. They were not the only people who knew this abandoned house held incredible secrets. Over the next few days, the paranoia steadily grew as they discovered fresh, unfamiliar boot prints pressed into the soft mud near the garden's edge. Richard hastily installed several outdoor security cameras, and when they reviewed the black and white footage late one night, they saw a shadowy, unrecognizable figure lingering near the tree line, watching the mansion with intense, unwavering focus. The race to uncover the grandfather's hidden truth had officially begun, and they were running entirely out of time. Driven by the terrifying realization that they were being actively watched, Madeline and Richard moved with desperate urgency to decode the hand-drawn maps. Every single line, symbol, and hidden margin note they studied seemed to converge on one specific location within the sprawling estate: the grand, 2-story wooden library located in the forgotten East Wing. The following morning, armed with flashlights, measuring tapes, and the brittle documents, they pushed open the heavy oak doors of the library, stepping into a massive room smelling of ancient paper and stale air. Thousands of decaying books, lined the towering shelves, stretching all the way up to the beautifully painted, vaulted ceiling. They spent agonizing hours cross-referencing the symbols on the map with the physical layout of the massive room, searching for any structural anomalies. It was Madeline who finally noticed a bizarre pattern among a specific collection of classic literature, resting on a lower shelf. Faint, barely visible numbers were etched into the leather spines of exactly 8 specific books, and they were arranged out of numerical order. When Richard pulled the books out and realigned them sequentially, the combined titles formed a cryptic riddle pointing toward the heavy wooden paneling at the far end of the room. Approaching the designated wall, Richard ran his calloused hands over the intricately carved wood until his fingers brushed against a familiar shape hidden within the design. It was the exact same 8-pointed star they had seen, drawn on the grandfather's secret maps. He pressed firmly against the center of the carved star, and a deep, mechanical groan reverberated through the floorboards, shaking the dust from the ceiling. A massive floor-to-ceiling section of the bookshelf slowly swung inward on massive iron hinges, revealing a pitch-black, narrow stone corridor descending deep into the earth. With their hearts hammering in their chests, Madeline and Richard gripped their flashlights tightly and stepped over the threshold into the damp, freezing darkness. The stone steps were steep and uneven, clearly carved by hand many decades ago by laborers who possessed incredible skill and discretion. As they descended deeper beneath the foundation of the house, the air grew noticeably colder, carrying the heavy, metallic scent of rusted iron and wet soil. This was no simple root cellar. It was an elaborate, highly expensive subterranean labyrinth designed to protect something of unimaginable value. After walking for what felt like miles, the narrow passage suddenly expanded into a breathtakingly large, cavernous underground chamber supported by thick, reinforced concrete pillars. In the dead center of the massive room stood an awe-inspiring, colossal vault door constructed of solid, impenetrable steel. The intricate locking mechanism consisted of multiple heavy brass dials, interconnected gears, and a large central wheel that looked like it belonged on a military submarine. Etched into the stone archway above the imposing steel door was a final, chilling message written in the grandfather's familiar handwriting. The inscription boldly declared that the ultimate legacy of the Carter family lay resting behind the steel, reserved strictly for the one who valued blood and loyalty over superficial greed. Madeline stared at the heavy vault, realizing that all the painful trials she had endured, the devastating loss of her parents, Lucy's brutal financial betrayal, and the terrifying threat of bankruptcy, had unknowingly led her directly to this exact spot. Richard immediately pulled out the notes they had translated from the hidden journals, knowing the combination to the dials had to be hidden within the grandfather's cryptic diary entries. They worked together in the dim, flickering light, carefully twisting the heavy brass dials to match the dates, coordinates, and numerical codes they had deciphered over the past several weeks. It was a grueling, frustrating process, and for a terrifying moment, the heavy dials refused to budge, leaving them to wonder if they had misinterpreted the final clues. But Madeline remembered the sequence of symbols hidden behind the old family portrait in the parlor, and she quickly instructed Richard to adjust the final dial accordingly. As the last brass number clicked into place, a thunderous, echoing thud resonated from deep within the thick steel door, signaling that the heavy internal locking bolts had finally retracted. Richard grasped the massive central wheel, straining his muscles as he turned it counterclockwise, the rusted metal shrieking in protest after decades of absolute silence. The heavy vault door slowly swung open, exhaling a rush of preserved, stale air, and as Madeline shined her flashlight into the dark interior, the brilliant, blinding reflection of what lay inside completely took her breath away. The interior of the massive vault was not just a simple storage room. It was a highly organized, climate-controlled sanctuary filled with unimaginable wealth. Madeline and Richard stepped inside, their flashlight beams dancing across rows of heavy steel tables, completely covered in perfectly stacked, gleaming bars of solid gold. Beside the gold sat dozens of antique velvet boxes overflowing with flawless diamonds, vibrant emeralds, and rare historic coins from around the world that were completely priceless. But the true, staggering magnitude of the fortune was discovered inside the towering rows of fireproof filing cabinets lining the back wall of the vault. Richard forcefully yanked open the top drawer of the nearest cabinet and pulled out thick, pristine folders containing active, high-yield international bonds, corporate stock certificates, and deeds to massive tracts of valuable real estate across multiple continents. These incredibly lucrative investments had been quietly compounding and accumulating massive wealth for decades, completely hidden from the government, the public, and the greedy hands of other family members. Madeline collapsed onto a nearby chair, burying her face in her trembling hands as the overwhelming realization washed over her. She was suddenly one of the wealthiest women in the entire country. They spent the entire night documenting the staggering contents of the vault, and by sunrise, they knew they desperately needed to hire a team of elite, trustworthy legal and financial professionals to handle the unprecedented discovery. The news of the massive, hidden treasure found inside the infamous haunted Savannah mansion inevitably leaked to the local press, instantly igniting a massive media frenzy that captured the attention of the entire nation. News vans surrounded the iron gates of the estate, helicopters circled overhead, and the once quiet rural town of Willow Creek was flooded with curious tourists and aggressive reporters. It did not take long for the explosive news to reach across the ocean, catching the immediate attention of the very person who had caused Madeline so much pain. Just 3 days after the story broke, a luxurious rental car pulled up to the mansion, and Lucy stepped out, demanding her equal share of the hidden gold. She brazenly filed an emergency lawsuit, claiming that the newly discovered wealth belonged to the entire family estate and that she was legally entitled to half of the millions of dollars. Simultaneously, Ethan Saunders filed his own aggressive legal injunction, presenting forged historical documents claiming his ancestors had a rightful stake to whatever was buried beneath the property line. The ensuing legal battle was incredibly fierce and highly publicized, but Madeline's team of elite lawyers possessed an absolute, undeniable advantage. Deep within the vault, they had discovered a final, sealed envelope containing the grandfather's ultimate last will and testament, written specifically for the person who unlocked the door. The letter explicitly detailed how he had intentionally left the visible, easily accessible assets as a test, knowing the greedy and selfish would eagerly grab them and run, leaving the true, massive fortune for the one who chose to stay and preserve the forgotten family home. The state judge reviewed the airtight documents, the historical journals, and the flawless legal phrasing of the grandfather's secret will, and ruled completely in Madeline's favor. Lucy's frivolous lawsuit was thrown out of court, leaving her publicly disgraced and entirely cut off from the true family legacy she had so quickly abandoned. Ethan Saunders was heavily fined for submitting fraudulent historical claims, forever ruining his professional reputation within the local real estate community. With the legal nightmare finally over, Madeline utilized a small portion of her vast new wealth to completely restore the magnificent Savannah mansion to its original, breathtaking glory. The rotting wood was replaced, the gardens were beautifully manicured, and the estate transformed from a terrifying local legend into a stunning beacon of historical triumph. Madeline and Richard stood side by side on the grand front porch one evening, watching the golden southern sunset filter through the ancient weeping willow trees. They had survived the darkest period of their lives, and through sheer resilience and unwavering loyalty, they had uncovered a future brighter than they ever could have dreamed. Life frequently tests our character through the incredibly heavy burdens we are abruptly forced to carry, and quite often, the most valuable treasures are hidden deeply beneath thick layers of dust, emotional hardship, and apparent ruin. True wealth is never merely about the selfish accumulation of gold, the towering balance of bank accounts, or the easy properties one can immediately sell to the highest bidder in a moment of panic. It is ultimately found in the quiet resilience of the human spirit, the unwavering loyalty we demonstrate to those who bravely stand by our side during our darkest hours, and the profound courage required to rebuild our broken lives from the ground up when everything else has been stripped away. Greed may occasionally offer a temporary blinding illusion of victory, leading the selfish to chase hollow prizes while carelessly abandoning their deepest roots. But genuine, lasting prosperity belongs solely to those who fiercely value integrity and family over a quick fortune. The old mansion had never truly been a curse, but rather a brilliant, careful sieve of character, proving definitively that when we face our deepest trials with an honest heart, the universe inevitably rewards our patient endurance with magnificent blessings far greater than anything we could have ever sought.